exploring the history within regards to exodus of the Jewish communities in Arab Muslim countries, especially 1948 time period. We've been speaking about this already. This is part number 3 here inside this series over here. So welcome to everyone that you're watching to this presentation as we explore the history of what actually went on all those years. It's going to be a bit more detailed. We are really picking up where we left off in the previous classes, friends, over here. So I think we're going to get this underway over here because we see about the, let's just say, the horrors that took place. Many Jewish communities had to lose all their properties, all their possessions after 1948, all the anti-Semitism there was, and not much compensation, not much is being spoken about it, but we on this channel very much are speaking about this. So we spoke about Iran yesterday and various other countries. Now let's talk about other Muslim majority countries. What actually happened in those Jewish communities at that point in time. Okay, so friends, let's first talk about Afghanistan. Now we know that the Afghan Jewish community declined from about, there was as many as 40,000 Jewish people in the early part of the 20th century to only 5,000 by 1934 due to the persecution. Many Afghanistani Jews would end up going to Iran, Persia, although I think some would come to Palestine at the time. Following the Kazakh famine, I think it was 1930 to 1933, a strong amount of Baharian Jewish people crossed the border into the Kingdom of Afghanistan as part of a wider famine-related refugee crisis. Leaders of the community would petition Jewish communities in both Europe and the United States for support. I believe in total, some 60,000 refugees had fled from the Soviet Union and reached Afghanistan. It was reported over. Now, I think it was, come what the year 1932, Mohammad Nadir Shah, he signed a border treaty with the Soviets in order to prevent asylum seekers at that point in time from crossing into the Afghanistani from Soviet Central Asia. Later that year, Afghanistan, reported over, had began deporting Soviet origin refugees either back at that point in time to the Soviet Union or to specified territories in China. Now, Soviet Jews who were already, I believe, present in Afghanistan, they had the intent, I think, to flee further south, were detained in Kabul, and all Soviet Jews were apprehended at the border, were immediately deported, reported over. All Soviet citizens, including, let's say, Baharian Jewish people at that point in time, were suspected by both the Afghanistani and British government officials of conducting at that point in time espionage with the intention to disseminate the Bolshevik propaganda. That's what's stated over. I think it was from September 1933. Many of these let's say, Soviet Jewish refugees in northern Afghanistan were forcibly relocated to major cities such as Kabul and Herat, but they would continue to live in under restrictions on work and trade. Whilst I think there was claims made that the November 1933 assassination of Mohammad Nadir Shah made the situation worse, this is likely to have had only a limited impact, according to many opinions. Come on 1935, the JTA, the Jewish Telegraph Agency, they reported that ghetto rules had been imposed on Afghanistani Jews, requiring them to wear a particular clothes. The Jewish women had to stay out of markets, and that no Jews live with certain distances of mosques, and that Jews did not ride horses. You can see this is humiliation and anti-Semitism at the highest degree over here. And, it's an othering of the Jewish community over here, and we have to point this over. This actually occurred. Crimes were committed. I think it was from between the years 1935 to 1941. At that point in time, the Prime Minister was Mohammed Hashim Khan, if I'm not mistaken. And I think they had a connection with the terrible Nazis. Now, the Nazis regarded the Afghans, just like the Iranians, as Aryans. I think in 1938 it was reported that the Jewish people were only allowed to work as shoe polishers. They were degraded to only that specific trade at that point in time. Contact with Afghanistan, I believe, at that point in time was difficult at the time. And let's just say with many Jewish people facing persecution around the world, reports reached the outside world after a delay and were rarely, let's say, researched thoroughly. The Jewish people were allowed to immigrate in 1951, and most were moved to the United States of America anti-Israel. Come on, 1969, I think 300 remain, and most of them left after the Soviet invasion, I think in 1979, leaving only 10 Afghanistani Jews in the year 1996. Most of them would live in Kabul at that point in time. And come on, I think it was 2007, a lot of the Jewish people of Afghanistani descent were now living in Israel. I think there will be amounts also coming into New York City reported over. So very interesting. We can see the anti-Semitism there was in Afghanistan at that point in time. Let's speak about some of the other smaller countries over here, friends, as we're exploring what went on 1948 time period among the Jewish communities in the Muslim countries. Now, Malaysia, another Jewish community that was there. I think Penang was historically home to a Jewish community of the Baghdadi origin that dated back to colonial times. Much of this community emigrated overseas in the decades following World War II, and the last Jewish resident of Penang passed away, reported over in 2011, which will make the committee distinct at that point in time. Very interesting. So, friends, anyone tuning in, we're exploring what happened over there. Now, Pakistan, remember, we recorded a video about the Pakistani Jewish community history, I believe it was probably about 2 months ago. So, very much recommend everyone to watch over that. Now, in Pakistan, I believe it was at the time of the Pakistani independence, I think it was in 1947, 1,300 Jews remained in Karachi, many of them from Bnei Yisrael Jews, observing, let's say, Sephardic Jewish rites. There was even a small Ashkenazi population was present in the city. Now, some Karachi streets still bear names that hark back to, let's say, a period when the Jewish community was more flourishing at that point in time, such as there's a street called Ashkenazi Street over there, or Abraham Reuben Street, named after the former member of the Karachi Municipal Corporation. There's also, I believe, Ibn Gabriel Street and Moses Ibn Ezra Street, although I think some streets over there have been renamed. They are still locally referred to by their original names by many people. The Bnei Israel Graveyard was a small Israel cemetery. I think it still actually exists, if I'm not mistaken, in the Mewao Shao Graveyard near the shrine of the Sufi saints. The neighborhood of Baghdadi in Lyra town is named for the Baghdadi Jews who once lived there. Now, that's interesting. I think there was a community of Bukharian Jews was found in Peshawar. Now, we spoke about this when we recorded the video about Pakistan, and very interesting enough, where many buildings in the old city feature a Star of David, Magen David, on the exterior decor as a sign of the Hebrew origins of its owner. Now, members of the community can go on to settle in the city as merchants as early as the 17th century, although the bulk arrived as refugees, fleeing the advance, obviously, at that point in time, Russian Empire into Bukhara. And later, the Russian Revolution in 1917. Today, I think there's virtually no Jewish communities remaining in Karachi or Peshawar, respectively. You know what we're speaking about. There was an exodus of Jews from Pakistan to Bombay and other cities, I believe, in India. It came prior to the creation of Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, in 1948. When I think at that point in time, there was anti-Israel sentiments would rise. And come on, 1953, fewer than 500 Jewish people were reported to reside in all of Pakistan. So it was a tiny community then. There was obviously anti-Israel sentiment. There was violence would flare up during ensuing conflicts in the Middle East, resulting in, let's just say, a further movement of Jews out of Pakistan. Presently, a large number of Jews from Karachi live in the city of Ramla in Israel. Now, friends, anyone tuning in live, welcome to our channel, and please subscribe if you are new to our community, as we've got fantastic content here. Let's speak about Sudan now. We recorded a video about the history of the Sudanese Jewish community not so long ago, only about a week ago. Now, the Jewish community in Sudan was concentrated in the capital of Khartoum and had been established in the late 19th century. I believe at its peak there was between about 1,930 and I think between it was 1930 to 1950, they had about 800 to 100 people. Mainly Jewish, obviously Sephardic, Mizrahi backgrounds from North Africa, from Syria, from Iraq. I think some will come even from Europe, if I'm not mistaken, in the 1930s. The community constructed a synagogue even. A synagogue, a club at its peak. There was a club. I don't know if it was a social club or what kind of club it was. And I think between 1948 to 1956, some members of the community would leave the country. Following the independence in 1956, hostility against, let's say, the Jewish community would begin to grow And I think come what 1957, many Sudanese Jews began to leave for Israel, the United States and Europe, particularly the United Kingdom and Switzerland. And come what the 1960s, the Sudanese Jewish community was very much depleted at that point in time. Obviously, the 1967 war, anti-Semitic attacks began to appear in the Sudanese, let's say, newspapers following the Six-Day War. They were even advocated torture, and God forbid, there was even murder of prominent Jewish community leaders, and there was a mass arrest of Jewish men. Jewish emigration will intensify as a result. The last Jewish people of Sudan left the country in the early 1970s. About 500 Sudanese Jews went to Israel. The rest will go to the United States of America and Europe. Now, Bangladesh, it's interesting. We recorded a history of the Jewish community of Bangladesh, I believe, on previous occasions before over here, friends, over here. So anyone that's tuning in live, welcome to our community, and welcome to our channel. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the community, to the channel, as we've got fantastic content over here. Okay, in Bangladesh, the Jewish population in East Bengal was 200 at the time of the partition of India in 1947. They included, let's say, Baghdadi Jews, merchant communities that settled in Dhaka during the 17th century. There was a prominent Jew in East Pakistan, was someone named Mordechai Cohen, who was a Bengali, an English newsreader on East Pakistan television. By the late 1960s, much of the Jewish community had left for Calcutta. Now, we spoke about Bangladesh Jewish community, and I think we spoke about Mordechai Cohen at the time inside that and that feature we did about Bangladesh, which I very much recommend everyone to watch. Okay, let's break down. So in 1948, reported over here using Wikipedia as a source, there was between 758,000 to 881,000 Jews living in communities throughout the Arab world. Today, there's fewer than 8,600 in some Arab states, such as in Libya, which was about 3% Jewish. The Jewish community no longer exists. In other Arab countries, only a few dozen to a few hundred Jewish people remain. Now, let's break it down. In 1948, the population of Morocco was between 250 to 265,000. I think come what 1972, this is not now, this is much lower now. 1972 was reported only 31,000. Algeria boasted 140,000 in 1948. 1972, shortly afterwards, only 1,000 Jews. In Tunisia, up to 105,000 Jews lived in 1948 and only about 8,000 in 1972. Obviously, the figure much lower. There was 35 to 38,000 Libyan Jews in 1948, till only about 50 come up 1972. Obviously, even way lower now. So Iraq had between 130 to 140,000 in 1948, only 500 come up 1942. Totally, and now probably there's hardly any. In Egypt, there was between 75 to 80,000 Jewish people. 1972, it became only 500. Yemen and Aden, 53,000 to 63,000 people, and only 500, 1972. Now, once again, much, much lower. In Syria, between 15 to 30,000 in 1948, only 4,000 come up 1972, obviously way lower now. Lebanon, 5,000 to 20,000 in 1948. It would still be modestly at 2,000 in 1972, but obviously now there's hardly any. Bahrain was between 550 to 600 in 1948. Sudan had about 350. And Afghanistan originally had about 5,000 in 1948. 1972, there was only 500. Obviously, there's no Jews now there. Iran had as many as 65 plus thousand people in 1956. And the community would actually grow after 1948, but obviously now it's way, way lower. Pakistan had between 2 to 2,500. Now, only be 250 Jews come on 1972. Now, obviously, way, way lower. 80,000 Turkish Jews in 1948. Only 30,000 in 1972, and now way lower, probably at least half of them, respectively. Let's talk about the absorption of the Jews. Anyone tuning in live, please subscribe to the channel and join our community now over here, as we have a lot of fantastic content here, not to be missed out. So please subscribe and join. We're nearing 8,000 subscribers over here. So let's aim to get to that by the end of today with that. Okay, absorption of the 900,000 Jewish immigrants, around 650,000 immigrated to Israel, and 235,000 would emigrate to France. The remainder will go to Americas, to Europe. About so 2/3 of the exodus was from the North Africa region, of which Morocco's Jews went mostly to Israel. Now, I believe Algeria's Jews mostly went to France, and Tunisia's Jewish communities would depart for both countries, if I'm not mistaken. Now, in Israel, the majority of Jews in Arab countries would eventually go to Eretz Israel, to Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were temporarily settled in numerous immigrant camps throughout the country. Those were later transformed into ma'abarot, transit camps, where I think there were tin dwellings were provided to house up to 220,000 residents. The ma'abarot existed until, I think, the 1960s. The population of transition camps was gradually absorbed and integrated into Israeli society. Many of the North African and Middle Eastern Jews had a more difficult time, you could say, adjusting to dominant culture, change of lifestyle, and there was a lot of claims of discrimination we have to point out that were well documented for these communities as it came to Israel. Now, France was a major destination. About 50%, 300,000 people of modern French Jews have roots from North Africa. In total, it's estimated that between 1956 and 1967, about 235,000 North African Jews from Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco emigrated to France due to the decline of the French Empire and following the Six-Day War. The United States was also a destination, especially among Egyptian, Lebanese and Syrian Jews, respectively, over there. Now, the Israeli government, the issue of, let's say, comparison of the Jewish exodus with the Palestinian exodus was raised, I think, originally in 1961 by the Israeli Foreign Ministry. Come on 2012, a special campaign on behalf of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries was established and gained more momentum. The campaign urged the creation of an international fund that would compensation for Jewish people, both Jewish and Palestinian, I think at that point, Palestinian Arab refugees, and would document and research the plight of Jewish refugees from Arab countries. In addition, the campaign plans to create, I think, a national day of recognition in Israel to remember the 850,000 Jewish refugees from Arab countries, as well as to build a museum that would document their history, cultural heritage, and collect their testimony. Remember, I think now the 30th of November has been assigned as that specific day in of itself, respectively. It was on 21st of September in the year 2012, a special event was held at the UN, the United Nations, to highlight the issue of the Jewish refugees from Arab countries. There was Israeli ambassador, someone named Ron Prosor. He asked, I believe, the United Nations to establish a center of documentation and research that will document the 850,000 untold stories and collect evidence to preserve their history, which he said was ignored for too long. At that point in time, the Israeli Deputy Foreign Minister was someone named Danny Ayalon. He said that we are 64 years late, he stated. Over here, very much so. 64 years late, he said. And but we are not too late. So he gave some assurance. Diplomats from approximately 2 dozen countries would actually come in at that point in time. Organizations and the United States, European Union, Germany, Canada, Spain, Hungary attended this event. In addition, Jewish people from Arab countries attended and spoke at the event. So friends, anyone tuning in live, subscribe to the channel. We are nearing 8,000 subscribers. Welcome if you're new here, as we're speaking about the mass exodus of Jewish communities from Arab Muslim lands after 1948, friends, over here. Okay. Property losses and compensation. In Libya, Iraq and Egypt, many Jews lost vast portions of their wealth and property as part of the exodus because of the restrictions, severe restrictions, on moving their wealth out of the country. In other countries, such as in North Africa, the situation was more complex. For example, in Morocco, immigrants were not allowed to take more than $60 worth of Moroccan currency with them. Crazy. It's a proper anti-Semitism, although generally they were able to sell their property prior to leaving, and some were able to work around the currency restrictions by exchanging cash into jewellery reports over portable values. This led some scholars, let's say, to speculate the Moroccan and Algerian Jewish populations, comprising a large percentage of the exodus, on the whole did not suffer large property losses, but they still did lose a lot of property at the end, maybe not as high as the other places. Doesn't make it okay over there. Now, Yemeni Jews were usually able to sell what property they possessed prior to departure, although not at market rates. So once again, even if they sold all their properties, they sold at much lower sums. So once again, they are shortchanged huge time. Let's assume it was all a bed and roses, which it wasn't. Estimated financial value. Now, various estimates of the value of property abandoned by the Jewish exodus, friends, have been published with wide variety in the quoted figures, from a few billion to hundreds of billions, friends. The World Organization of Jews from Arab countries, the WOJAC, estimated in 2006 that Jewish property abandoned in Arab countries would be valued at more than $100 billion. Last revising the estimated now in 2007 to $300 billion. They also estimated Jewish-owned real estate left behind in Arab lands at 100,000 square kilometers, 4 times the state of Israel. Now, this is like staggering, friends, over here. You won't hear this in the news media, that's for sure. Now, I think the official position of the Israeli government is that Jews from Arab countries are considered refugees, and it considers their rights to property left in countries of origins as valid and extinct. Now, the Orthodox Sephardic Party in 2008, Shas, announced its intention to seek compensation for Jewish refugees from Arab states. In 2009, Israeli lawmakers introduced a bill into the Knesset to make compensation for Jewish people from Arab and Muslim countries an integral part of any future peace negotiations by requiring compensation on behalf of current Jewish Israeli citizens who were expelled from Arab countries after Israel was established in 1948, and leaving behind, let's say, a big amount of valuable property. I think it was in February 2010, the bill passed its first reading. The bill was sponsored by Knesset member Nissim Ziv, I think it was from Shas, and follows a resolution passed in the United States House of Representatives in 2008, calling for refugee recognition to be extended to Jews and Christians, similar to that extended to Palestinians in the course of Middle East peace talks. Friends, anyone tuning in live, we are exploring the history of actually what went on 1948 time period among the Jews in Arab lands in a special edition of here. So friends, anyone tuning in live, welcome to our community. Let's talk a bit more. I found a good resource over from the Fonda.com. They give actually a good illustration, just speaking about some of the anti-Semitism that actually took place, and especially the pogroms in 19th century under the Ottoman Empire over here. So this is obviously, there was no Israel at that point in time, or state of Israel. So why is it anti-Semitism there? So let's talk a bit about this for a short period of time. So now I think I'm just using the article over here that's written in that website. In the 19th century, under the Ottoman Empire, Palestinian Jews lived mainly in Jerusalem, Tzfat, Tiberias, Haifa, and Saint John d'Acre. I think they had smaller communities. In Jerusalem, as let's say it was often the case in Arab Muslim area, the Jewish condition was marked by a climate of humiliation and widespread fear, as witnessed in the 19th century by the Jewish traveller, someone named Abraham Ya'ari, in his book Voyages on Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Arabs are violently hostile to the Jews and persecute the children of Israel in the streets of the city. If a notable, or even let's just say a lower class citizen, lays their hands on a Jew, we have no right to reciprocate, whether Arabs or Turks, for they are of the same religion. If a Jew is hit, he must adopt a supplicant attitude and not retaliate with unkind words even. This is real discrimination, disgusting over here. Let's receive even more blows, for in their eyes we are people or of nothing. Now, the Sephardim behave like this because they're already used to it, they say. But Ashkenazi Jews are not yet used to being struck by Arabs, and they respond with insults if they can speak their language. If not, they gesticulate in anger and then they are beaten even more. It's the same for, let's say, Christians, uncircumcised, who are in exile, like the Jews, except that the uncircumcised have a lot of money because they receive it from the kingdoms of Europe, and with this money they can bribe the Turks. The Jewish people didn't have a lot of money at that point in time, he said over here in this article. Therefore, they're even more exiled. I think it was in 1831. Now, so this is just giving an idea of what it was like over here in the holy city of Jerusalem for the Jewish community there. In 1831, southern Syria, the Arabic name for the province known as Westernizers, as a holy land, of which Sfat was a part of, was annexed by Mehmet Ali, and he was the viceroy of Egypt. And Sfat's Jewish community, one of the largest in the country, had long been predominantly Jewish, as evidenced, I think, around the year 1625. There was an Italian Orientalist, someone named Franciscus Corasmius, I believe. He wrote of Sfat that it was inhabited mainly by Hebrews, where they have their synagogue and schools, and the community was strengthened by the, let's say, arrival of Russian Jews between 1776 to 1781, followed by there were Jewish people coming from Lithuania in 1809 to 1816, which is very interesting. Friends, anyone tuning in live, please subscribe to the channel. We're a community here where we're learning about the history, our Jewish history, in all different countries in the Arab lands of yesteryear, and about the rabbis also. So please subscribe and join as we're nearing 8,000 subscribers. Okay, now Sfat is part of a vilayet, let's say, of Sidon, and the Vialet Jews live mainly in Sfat and Tiberias. From 1831 to and onwards, let's just say, the Egyptian governance of Palestine, delegated by Mehmet Ali to Ibrahim Pasha, led to a process of modernization that would upset the traditional, let's say, social fabric between communities. And ultimately, there was an uprising by the rural Arab population that focused its violence, unfortunately, once again on Jews. Instead, one of Mehmet Ali's main decisions was to favor Jews and Christians who had, let's say, hitherto been overlooked in the management and in his administration of his provinces, including the Nile Valley and Palestine. He also sought to surround himself with many Westerners to carry out major reforms and large-scale projects. Now, I think it was under his reign that Ashkenazic Jewish community obtained the annulment of the Ottoman decree prohibiting them from settling in Jerusalem. Hence the anger of the main notables, both Islamic religious dignitaries and local rural chiefs too, from Nablus to Hebron, and I think from Jerusalem to Jaffa, saw that power henceforth strictly controlled by the administration of Mehmet Ali of Egypt and not by Istanbul. What's more, I think the governor Ibrahim Pasha, sent by Mehmet Ali, implemented a major tax reform that introduced equality before the law. This was, I think, bound at that point to upset the privileged and who had been brought back under common law, upset the social balance as soon as they could no longer live as they once did over there, of the taxes paid by non-Muslims. Added to this were new taxes on harvest, particularly olives, which remained, I think, a major produce in the region, if I'm not mistaken. So that's very, very interesting. Now, over here, so I think, anyone tuning in live, we're exploring, once again, the history of what went on in the Arab countries at the time period of the mass exodus. So we're going just back a little bit because we didn't speak about the early years before that point in time. Okay, so I think continuing with his reformist approach, Ibrahim Pasha implemented at that point in time compulsory conscription through a lottery system that involved at that point the entire population. This decision added to the dissatisfaction of the predominant peasantry. This policy of openness towards Christian and, let's say, Jewish minorities would provoke the wrath of both conservative and popular circles. Suddenly it will force people to admit the disappearance of the discriminated conditions of the Jewish people, which until, I think, then had only been the mark of their presumed superiority. They then had, I think, fomented and led an insurrection to get rid of them, targeting non-Muslims, in particular Jews, who were to pay a high price. It was against this backdrop that in May 1834, revolt broke out in the regions of Nablus, Hebron, of Bethlehem, Tzfat, furious farmers, probably incited by a local preacher named Muhammad Damour, who proclaimed himself an Islamic prophet, attacked the Jews, destroying their homes and committing all manner of violence. The pogroms officially began on reported over June the 5th, 1834, and it lasted 33 days. It was carnage, reported over here, just using websites. Armed Arab and Bedouin villagers, as well as inhabitants of Tzfat, including, I believe, Turks, would massacre the Jewish and unfortunately rape their wives. You can see, just like October 7th, over here, 2023. Over here, that actually won't pronounce. The death toll probably exceeded 500. Synagogues were looted and then set on fire, and precious objects were stolen or destroyed. I think there was a book, The Event of Time, if I'm not mistaken. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kamenetz bears witness to the violence. On Sunday, Sivan the 18th, looters from neighboring villages of Tzfat went onto the rampage. They were joined by residents of other provinces. So you can see really October 7th over here, with swords and deadly weapons. They threw themselves on Jews, pushed them to the ground, tore off their clothes of both men and women, and drove them, it's so horrific what's happened, drove them naked from the town and ransacked their possessions. Nothing would remain. They even tore up the Torah scrolls, as well as the Talitim and the Tfilin at that point in time. The Talits and the Tfilin, respectively. I think from his hiding place, it was a rabbi named Rabbi Yisrael of Shklov. He would actually go on to send several letters to the consuls of foreign states in Beirut. He informed them in detail of the hardship endured by several of their nationals. I think Jewish subjects, if I'm not mistaken, protected by foreign powers. In response, the consuls encouraged Ibrahim Pasha to go to Tzfat to quell the rebellion. He entrusted this mission to the Druze Emir Bashir, who came down to the Galil from his home in Lebanon. And I think it was somewhat the midnight 1834. The riot had subsided, and most of the rioters had fled. Several of their leaders were arrested and executed on the street. When the Jewish residents of Tzfat came back to their homes after looting and destruction, despite the aid from, the consuls and neediest among them, the majority found themselves absolutely devastated. They managed to salvage less than 10% of their belongings worth. Additionally, the sole Hebrew printing press in the entire Syria-Palestine region, established 3 years prior by an Ashkenazic Jewish person, some named Israel Bak, he lived between 1797 to 1834, was also demolished. So you can see the severe anti-Semitism there was in those days way earlier on. So that's something we had to point out over here. Yeah, so we can see that there was also in pogroms of 1838. I think in 1838, a pogrom was repeated in August of that year. Over 3 days, the Druze supported by Arabs would go on to rebel against Egyptian rule at that point in time. And once again, I think they would, if I'm not mistaken, attack the Jewish community in Tzfat. The devastation would mirror that of 1834, it was reported over. So the Jews were murdered, homes were plundered, synagogues desecrated, women assaulted. Many Jewish people sought refuge in Saint Jean d'Acre or Jerusalem, resulting, I think, in fewer than 1,000 families now remaining in Tzfat at that point in time. Louis Lowe, I think, would later serve as secretary to renowned English Jewish philanthropy. Sir Moses Montefiore, who we've spoken about on various occasions before, was in Palestine at the time and attested, let's just say, to these events. In addition to everything they had looted, the Druze demanded from the Jewish people a sum equivalent of 2,500 English pounds, which I think, of course, the Jewish people were unable to pay. The Druze then seized the rabbi in charge of the Ashkenazi community, an elderly man, tied his hands and feet and placed a blade of a sword to his neck. They threatened to cut off, at that point in time, his head if the money is not paid immediately. He did not ask to be spared his life, which he was willing to sacrifice if it was meaning saving his community. All he asked for was a little clean water. He poured over his hands so that he can say a tefillah, a prayer, and proclaim that God is just in all his ways. Then all present let out a heart-rending cry, and the Druze themselves seemed to have been touched. They withdrew the sword and finally agreed to settlement within the community, giving it time to find a way to borrow the sum demand. Now you can see, sadly, even the Druze community took part to some degree over here, albeit that in this case it didn't. They gave them a chance to raise money. Pogroms of Tzfat in 1834 and 1838 were driven by religious, let's just say, animosity. There was a pattern similarly seen in the massacre of Christians by Druze on Mount Lebanon in 1860. I think between the 9th of July and July the 9th and July 17th in 1860, violence erupted from Lebanon and the Golan Heights, which reached Damascus. Nearly 6,000 Christians fell victim to bloodshed, with almost a third of the city's Christian population, led by the Ottoman government. Ahmed Pasha would face, I think at that point in time, the attackers. This massacre prompted a mass exodus of Christians seeking refuge in Europe, Africa, the Americas, and even Egypt. Many Christian families of Syria and Lebanon descent, I believe, found sanctuary in Egypt towards the close of the 19th century, right at the end of the 1800s, respectively, over here. Friends, anyone tuning in live, please subscribe to the channel. We are exploring the history of what went on in the Muslim countries, or the Jewish communities. Now we're going back a little bit because it's a three-part series. What went on before Zionism at that point in time? We're looking at the early years, and we can see the shocking discrimination there was against Jews. Now there was a decline of the Ottoman Empire and the rise of Islamic anti-Zionism. Now, following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which had allied itself in Central Powers during the Great War, its Arab territories fell under the control of the United Kingdom and France. This division agreed upon in secret by the Franco-British Sykes-Picot Agreement, I believe in 1916. It was formalized, I believe, at the San Remo Conference in 1920 in April. Subsequently, come 1922, in July of that month, the League of Nations granted mandates to France for Syria and Lebanon, and to the United Kingdom for Palestine and the Mesopotamia, I believe. And I think in Palestine, the Balfour Declaration of November 1917 pledged London's commitment to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people. Now, I believe this vision advocated was obviously by the Zionistic movement, emerging very much in the late 19th century, with encounter opposition from obviously the Arab community at that point. Initially political in nature, before 1914, this opposition assumed an Islamic character from 1920 onwards, tapping, let's just say, into the amplifying long-standing Muslim rejections of all Jews. The rejection mirrored the historical treatment of dhimmis, who sought, I believe, to shed their subordinate status and claim equality with Muslims. Very interesting. So, yeah. Friends, anyone tuning in live at the moment, please subscribe to the channel. We are nearing, at the moment, 8,000 subscribers. So welcome to our community, and please subscribe. Now, it's just so we're going to continue over here. Just stretching my arms a little bit. As we continue, okay. Now let's talk about the emergence of Western anti-Semitic tendencies. I think prior to 1914, Arab opposition to Zionism, especially among the educated Christian Arab elite in Palestine, who were more literate than the Sunni Muslim majority, made a clear distinction between Jews and Zionists, like many people try to do nowadays. However, after the Great War, with the rise of Islamization of anti-Zionism, this distinction faded away. Let's just say this shift was very evident during the first massacres in Jerusalem, especially in 1920, and in Jaffa, Tel Aviv in 1921. Well, I think there were chants like, Jews, I don't want to state it here, Jews are like dogs, and we will drink the blood of the Jews, disgraceful anti-Semitic tropes. They replaced slogans targeting Zionists. And in 1919, leaflets, I believe, circulated in Jerusalem and Jaffa, likened Jews not specifically to Zionists, but to state over here, Wikipedia actually states it poisonous snakes, how disgraceful. The same year, explicitly, anti-Jewish slogans call for violence even. The Yarmouk quotes over here, and they say that we're full of blood. But Palestine will not belong to the Jews. That was their phrase at the time. Thank God it does. I mean, the outright rejection of Zionism soon reproduced the older themes of Western anti-Semitism let's say, familiar to Christian Arabs. In the immediate aftermath of the Great War, a powerful wave of anti-Semitism swept across Europe, making the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, I believe, a success. Now, I think it was in Pakistan, the rejection of Zionism made this, let's say, anti-Semitic forgery of Russian origin a cornerstone of its discourse, and they would appoint, if I'm not mistaken, Secretary of State for the colonies in March 1921. Winston Churchill travelled to Cairo, or whatever, where he received Palestinian delegates who, in memorandum they handed over to him, took up his, let's just say, the main anti-Semitic themes conveyed by this foreign document. And they would also do again on several occasions during the interwar period in the same way. They reminded, let's just say, here, they would remind the Westerners of the, let's give the phrase, a killing of, Yoshka, as we say over him, attempt to poison the Prophet. That was their anti-Semitic ways of enticing people, let's just say, at that point in time. Yeah, so very interesting. So I think there was pogroms once again in 1920 till 1931. I think it was in the spring of 1920. It was Muslim pilgrimage of Nabi Musa, the Prophet Moses, scheduled for April the 4th, which happened, I think, to coincide with the Jewish festival of Passover that year. Okay, friends, anyone tuning in live, let's just take a break for a minute. Please subscribe to the channel. We're nearing 8,000 subscribers. Welcome to our community. If you are new here, we're exploring the history over here of Arab Jews that lived in Arab lands before 1948. So if you're new here, please subscribe and welcome. We'll have fantastic content here. Okay, so it was in Pesach of that year, against the backdrop of the Balfour Declaration and, let's say, the newly established British presence, the convergence of, let's say, at that point in time, of holidays that would take on a distinct political significance. The pilgrimage holds historical weight as it established by Saladin, who would go on to felicitate Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem, and after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, it was that this Friday, April the 4th, 1920, was a day of great prayer. It's reported over in front of an ecstatic, let's just say, crowd, including 600 pilgrims, I think there was, who had entered the city the day before. The mayor of Jerusalem called on everyone to give their blood for Palestine. That was the phrase. The crowd chorused. We were most anti-Semitic, let's just say, titles in of itself. And you can see just how horrific the Jewish community was, really wanting the death of the Jews. This was a signal, I think, for a 4-day outburst of violence. It was between April the 4th to April the 7th in 1920, it happened to be, at that point in time, during which, I believe, it would be the mob ransacked, they mutilated and killed Jews as they passed through the very heart of Jerusalem. The British-led Arab police contingent would not intervene once again, and some Arab policemen even took part in the riot. More than 200 Jews were injured, mostly by stabbings, as you can see, and many were killed. I think many women, unfortunately, were also raped. So really, once again, similar to what we experienced October the 7th, only just over 2 years ago. So you can see over here the disgracefulness over here that there was at that stage in time. Okay, friends, anyone tuning in live, we're speaking about the history of the Muslim countries over here, so please don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel over here. Once again, just stating that. Okay, so let's talk a bit about the British would appoint a commission of inquiry known as the Palin Commission, which presented its conclusions for a few months later. It held Palestinian associations, I believe, responsible for the violence. The first consequences of the pogrom was to uproot the Jews who had always lived in Jerusalem's old cities, many of whom were moved to the city's western districts, I think it was. A year later, violence will break out, I think, in Jaffa, a mixed city where I think 26,000 Arabs and 16,000 Jews lived together, following, let's say, a demonstration organized on Labor Day, happens to be at that stage in time, by I think it was Jewish communist and socialist demonstrators who would find themselves in conflict, as they often did. Some Arabs interfered, strangers to the quarrel. They turned it into a pogrom, forcing open doors of an immigrant home and massacring its inhabitants. As in Jerusalem, the previous year, some of the Arab policemen referred to intervene or even took part, unfortunately, in the murders. It's reported over here. So, yeah, you can see how horrific anti-Semitism was at that stage in time. Now, there was a pogroms of 1929, which we spoke about before, and the role of the Grand Mufti. We recorded, I think, about this, in the Tisha B'Av time period, when we recorded about Hebron on that specific day, respectively, over there. Anyone tuning in live, once again, please subscribe to the channel, to the community, as we've got fantastic content over here on this channel, history content over here. Okay, so the pogroms of 1929 and the role of the Grand Mufti. I think appointed rather than elected by the British in the spring of 1921, the Amin al-Husseini assumed at that point in time the role of the Mufti of Jerusalem. He would represent both a powerful clan and a rural, archaic Palestine. He elevated the Jewish-Arab conflict to the regional sphere, I think, exacerbating tensions with frequent provocations, which, let's just say, surrounded the issue of the Kotel, the Western Wall, the Kotel Maravi, as they say, the Wailing Wall. In front of the wall, Jews had only a small area for prayer and a passageway approximately 4 meters wide. At the time, there was no expensive, let's say, plaza as we know today. Obviously, now it's stunning. I mean, obviously, it's always stunning, just seeing the Kotel lit up. But it's not been beautified with all those renovations. Like now, this narrow piece of land belonged apparently to a Jewish religious Muslim foundation. It is a Waqf property and therefore theoretically inalienable. That's what's stated here in the article, what they're quoting. At least 2 Jewish attempts to acquire it, I think in 1840 and 1911, was unsuccessful. Thank God we had successful. Obviously, we were able to get it. I think it was in, it was in 1967. Yeah, sorry about that. Just the connection went for a minute. 1967, after we won the war, we were able to get, thank God, the Kotel Maravi back at that point in time. So that's something we have to point out. Maybe we'll do a special video within regards to the 1967 war on a separate occasion. Bezrat Hashem. At the head of the Muslim Supreme Council, where the British had placed him in 1922, he had been enthroned as Mufti of Jerusalem by the same British, I believe, at that point in time. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem used Jewish provocations as a pretext to set up a committee for the defense of Muslim holy places in Jerusalem. Al-Burqa al-Sharif, I think the Arabic name for the Western Wall, if I'm not mistaken, was one of them. And I think in November 1928, at the same time, he convened, I think, the Islamic conference to be held in the city 3 years later. I think in spring 1929, following the Yom Kippur incident of the previous year, the Grand Mufti escalated his own provocations against the Jews. They call over there of the calls of the muezzin echoed as loudly as possible during the Jewish prayers, and amplified by the booming public address system. I believe also cultural, let's say, junctures into Jewish liturgy. He orchestrated traditionally boisterous Sufi ceremonies, let's just say, which complete with symbols, conduct rite, giving a whole, let's say, liturgy over here with regards to what was going on at that stage of time. So yeah, you can see the times of that it was over there at that stage in time, the kind of anti-Semitism. Okay, so I think at the I think in spring 1929, following there was a Yom Kippur incident before, but I think come up to spring 1999, there was, following this Yom Kippur incident of the previous year, the Grand Mufti escalated its own provocations against the Jews over there. So in May 1929, Jewish worshippers gathered in front of the Kotel, the Western Wall, and were insulted and pelted with stones. In June 1929, the British High Commissioner, someone named John Chancellor, proposed at that point in time restricting Jewish access to the Kotel the Western Wall in the hope of satisfying Muslims' fears of an outbreak of violence. You can see they always try and blame the Jewish, and this is terrible, terrible anti-Semitism. It was all in vain, as many Arab leaders had realized that sectarian hatred was the only way to revive a divided and flagging national movement. If they managed to politicize the religious question, explains, I think, Nadine Piquet-Duo, who happens to be a historian, it could become a powerful tool for mobilizing Muslims across the world. That's how they felt. At the same time, supporters of Zionistic leader Zeev Jabotinsky, who I think his movement had left the Zionistic organization 4 years later, were determined not to back down. And I think they demanded that the British government recognise the presence of Jews in front of the Kotel as a right, not as a tolerance, a demand officially reiterated on August 11, 1929 by the Zionistic Congress in Zurich. Remember, we spoke about how in Zurich they had all the Zionistic congresses. The tension would increase, especially as Tisha B'Av, if I'm not mistaken, approached, and the 9th day of the month of Av, also known as 15th of August 1929, was a day of mourning of Jewish tradition commemorating the destruction of the two temples. The previous day, I think August 14th, if I'm not mistaken, 3,000 Jewish people, prayers inside the synagogue, had gathered in front of the wall in the Arab community. Rumours spread that the Jews were preparing to march at that point in time onto the mosque, if I'm not mistaken. That's what's reported here. The mosque Esplanade, and I think leaflets will be brandished at that point in time, if I'm not mistaken. There will be leaflets that will be given, and warning the Jews who are preparing this march, let's just say, in of itself. Leaflets were distributed in the city, and I think surrounding Arab areas also would actually pass all these leaflets, and it would urge people to attack the Jewish people and march to Jerusalem to save the holy places from Jewish insults. So you can see real anti-Semitism over there. And there's other readings over here, which we're not going to speak about now, per se, but you can just see there was just a lot going on, anti-Semitic point of view over here. Now, I think Jabotinsky's movement responded by marching its Beitar activists. He was the head of Beitar, I believe, a Jewish youth movement, and they would march past the wall on August 15th. That was Tisha B'Av. The movement's younger members flew the Zionistic flag of blue and white, chanting, "The wall is ours." For the Muslims, this was a provocation, which the very next day, I believe, I think Friday, the August 16th, led to a counter-demonstration with the same cry, "The wall is ours," but punctuated by walls to slit the Jews' throats. How terrible anti-Semitism was in those points over here. So that would be the thing. Then I think there was incidents would remain limited, and despite at that point in time the murder on Saturday, August the 17th, of a Jewish child who had been beaten to death by his Arab neighbor for trying to retrieve a ball he had accidentally dropped inside the garden. You can see the disgraceful incidents that actually took place in the murders over here. Yet it was within the Arab community that tension reached its peak, fueled by rumours of an impending Jewish assault on the mosque Esplanade. Meanwhile, across the divide, the Jewish community buzzed with fears of impending massacres. Now, in the days leading up to, I think it was Friday, August the 23rd, emotions would run high, and there was apprehension, let's just say, mounting as at that point in time there was armed Arab villages. They began, let's say, converging onto Jerusalem from the Thursday, and I think come August the 22nd, they would put sticks and knives, and on Friday the August 23rd, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Amidst a large Arab crowd, they gathered for the Friday prayer at that point in time, and they would call to attack the Jews. It would spread between noon, even before the conclusion of the tefillah in of itself. Now, following, I believe, the imams, he gave over a speech at that point in time, an anti-Semitic speech. The men poured out from the mosque and would assail the Jewish quarters, and there was a chaotic mob armed with, I think, an assortment of people, weapons, including sticks, knives, sabras, clubs, pitchforks. It would surge the Jewish quarter at that point in time of the old city over there. and they would come, and there was violence would come around over there, and many fatalities upon the Jews, especially in their path. The violence will spill into Mea Shearim, quarter exclusively inhabited by Orthodox Jews. On August 28th, Georges Archard, head of the French consuls in Jerusalem, reported it was a scene of carnage, with Arabs slitting the throats of those in front of them or stoning them to death. You can see really it sheds a tear in our eyes over here of all the disgracefulness, and showing no mercy for the women and children. That's what's stated over. So just horrifics. And I think the police were overwhelmed. The British forces, reduced to less than 100 soldiers, were outnumbered. And despite reinforcements, let's say, sent in over the following days, Arab policemen, even though they were mandatory government officials, refused to fire on the rioters. The violence would spread to Hebron, as we've spoken about before. And on the same day, the only British policeman present in the city, someone named Raymond Kafarata, would testify to the collusion of many Arab policemen with the rioters at that point. So you can't trust anyone at that point in time, especially you can see that horrors actually happened pre-1948 in Jerusalem. While no English policemen opened fire, the Haganah, the Jewish self-defense military force in 1920s, Haganah actually means defense in Hebrew, they managed at that point in time to protect several Jewish neighborhoods with the help of few Christian Arabs who came to the aid of their Jewish neighbors. Now, a historian, someone named Benny Morris, writes, the simultaneity of several armed attacks on outlying neighborhoods led to Jews at least to assume the existence of centralized coordination and preparation. Two significant Jewish libraries belonging to someone named Joseph Klausner and S.J. Agnon were destroyed in Jerusalem, resulting in the loss of over 3,000 rare documents on the history of Palestine in the flames. This tragedy occurred 5 years after Agnon had already lost his library in Berlin to a fire. On Friday, the 23rd of August, 17 Jews lost their lives in and around Jerusalem. The violence would spread to Tel Aviv on August 25th, where Arab demonstrators attempted to enter the city. So you can see it's spilling over even in Tel Aviv over there at that point in time. British police responded by opening fire. Simultaneously, I believe in Haifa, Arab rioters would ransack the Jewish district of Hadar HaKarmel, resulting in 23 deaths. Once again, anti-Semitism, no formation of State of Israel yet. As a consequence, 60% of the Jewish villages in Palestine came under attack, with homes and equipment destroyed, crops set ablaze, and livestock slaughtered. I believe 6 Jewish settlements were completely obliterated. Now, the most horrific massacres occurred in Hebron, one of the 4 holy cities of Israel. And at that point in time, I think there were 600 predominantly Orthodox Jews were there. And it was on a Shabbat, on a Saturday, on the August 24th in 1929. And I think it was within, at that point in time, the 2 hours, 67 Jews, including 12 women and 3 children from the ultra-Orthodox community, unfortunately, were brutally murdered at that point in time. And I think someone named Raymond Kafarata, the English police chief in Hebron, along with a lone Jewish policeman, courageously fired on the rioters, while I think at that point in time, the policemen refused to intervene. And amidst, obviously, the chaos, hundreds of Jews were rescued by the Arab neighbors in Jerusalem, in Hebron, and in St. Jean, at the Accra, and in Lida itself. I think even near Tel Aviv, Arab police officers stepped in to protect the Jews amidst the turmoil. But we saw the horrors actually took place on that specific date in of itself, which I recommend. I think we recorded at the time period of Tisha B'Av a video of the Hebron massacre of that specific time period in itself. So you can see even pre-1948, especially in 1800s and the early parts of the 1900s, all these pogroms and all these terrible acts that was taking place, and all the bullying and all the anti-Semitism of all the Jewish communities over there in Israel actually took place at such a high rate, and the horrors actually took place, how terrible actually it was. So friends, I'm going to call it a day over here, so please don't forget to subscribe, friends. We're closing to 8,000 subscribers over here, so watch all the content, enjoy, and wishing you all a fantastic day. Take care.